Hello, welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm Iris Borowski, and I have the pleasure of introducing our Grand Rounds speaker today, Dr. Marla Eisenberg. Marla is an associate professor in pediatrics, and she is also the director of research in our Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Health. Marla got her undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin in English and philosophy. She then went on to get a master's of public health here at the University of Minnesota, a doctor of science at the Harvard University School of Public Health, and then fortunate for us, she came back here for postdoctoral training in adolescent health and then joined our faculty. So Marla's research focuses on social influences on adolescent health and risk behaviors. So particularly focusing on environmental contexts, so community, schools, and their impact on a host of health and risk behaviors like weight control behaviors, bullying, high-risk sexual behaviors, and just emotional well-being. So today, Marla will share with us some of her work and her expertise around bullying involvement, particularly among vulnerable youth. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marla Eisenberg.
Can you all hear me? Can I try it again? Okay, all right, I'm on. All right. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing around bullying and harassment among adolescents, looking at it from the bully side, the victim side, and focusing specifically on some groups of vulnerable youth. I have nothing to disclose, so I'll just start with a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll give a little bit of introduction on what bullying is, who's involved, how much of a problem this is. I'll speak very briefly on the so what question. Why are we even concerned about this? Talk a little bit about what is related to bullying behaviors. What are the different kinds of factors that might predict bullying behavior that we might be able to intervene on with kids? And then think about what's next in terms of the research and some action points that we can take to work towards prevention of this behavior. All right, I'll start off with just a basic definition to make sure we're all on the same page. Bullying is defined by the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, as well as a number of other organizations, as having three specific components. This is an aggressive behavior, and it's intended to do harm. It's not joking around. It's not messing around, fooling around with friends. It's intended to be hurtful and harmful between one student or a group of students to another student or young person. Bullying is necessarily a repetitive experience or a repetitive behavior. Happens again and again and again. Kids who are experiencing this are stressed and worried about going to school because they know that they're going to get this kind of behavior directed at them again and again. It is not the one-off kind of thing where someone wakes up is having a terrible day and lashes out at another student, or has a fight after school once. That violent as that is, and as much as we want to prevent that kind of thing, that wouldn't come under this same heading of a repetitive bullying experience. And the third part of the definition, which I think often gets forgotten, is the imbalance of power in a bullying dynamic. So one person or one group of people need to have some sort of strength over the victim of the bullying. And this can be a physical strength, where you can get into the hitting and the pushing around, can be just an intimidating size or an intimidating manner, but there's got to be that advantage in a physical sense or also in some kind of social sphere. There are a number of other bullying behaviors that I'll mention in a second that don't rely on physical aggression, but rely on some sort of manipulation of social factors that can be very damaging. We all know that kids need to have friends, and popular student or a popular group of students or the class clown, someone with a lot of friends and can rally a lot of peer support around them, they might have a greater social influence than somebody who doesn't have a lot of that kind of support. So those are the three pieces of bullying, just to keep in mind. I've alluded a little bit to different types of bullying, which I'll be talking about. The first is physical bullying, and that's often what people think of when they first hear the word. It's the punching or the tripping in the hall. It's vandalizing someone's property, stealing their backpack, stealing their lunch money, shoving someone into a locker. It's very visible behaviors. It's physical. It hurts in the body. The relational and social behaviors I've also already alluded to. This is a relatively new area that's been more recently conceptualized as bullying, where people use social relationships to damage each other. So this can be keeping a group of friends, but excluding one other person who maybe was part of that group of friends last week. It can be spreading rumors or spreading lies about somebody to damage their social reputation, damage their social network. It's working those social relationships in a way that's going to be hurtful to another person. One of the real challenges with this type of bullying, I find, is that it's often invisible. It's hard to see someone and identify a bullying situation when it's the absence of saying hi to someone you were best friends with yesterday. So it's a little bit harder to hone in on those, but they can be very painful kind of circumstances to be in. And the third one I'll mention briefly is cyberbullying. I think people have started to hear more about cyberbullying in the news. We hear about it as a rising issue. And this can be either the physical bullying or threats of physical bullying and this kind of intimidation for personal safety, or it can be the relational and social components. It can be the rumor spreading or the damaging social relationships. But the key factor here is that it takes place online or using some digital means by texting. It occurs in the cyber world. One of the challenges with this is that it's very difficult to escape from. Because kids are online so much or on screen so much, there's very little safe space where they are completely away from the bully, the way in olden days you might think of somebody getting home from the playground and they're in their safe space. It's harder to find that with cyberbullying. Okay. Oops. Who's involved with this? This is a behavior that cuts across all groups of young people, regardless of their gender, their age group, different racial and ethnic groups, different socioeconomic status groups, all have bullying occurring in their circles. This does not discriminate as a behavior. However, there are a couple particularly vulnerable groups that I'm going to highlight today. And these are groups that get more than their fair share of bullying. And I'm thinking specifically here of young people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, young people who are overweight or obese, or youth with disabilities. These are groups that are generally in the research literature and in practice seen to be more vulnerable to bullying and harassment than kids without these particular vulnerable characteristics. In talking about how much bullying is going on, it's a little bit hard to pin down numbers, and people hear different estimates from every different study because there are a lot of different ways to assess this. There are different ways to ask the question, and when are we talking about what happened in the past month or talking about in the past year, and how are we measuring the frequency that it's going on, different samples of kids. So there are a lot of different estimates, but the numbers that I'm going to talk about today all are local. They come from the Minnesota Student Survey, the 2013 administration of the survey, and this is a wonderful resource. It's a surveillance instrument that's given every 3 years across the state of Minnesota. And in 2013, it also included fifth graders, but the data I'm showing today are from 8th, 9th, and 11th grade students. And they come from all parts of Minnesota. Every district is invited, every school district, and the overwhelming majority do participate. Upwards of 80 or 85% participated, I think, in 2013. And within participating schools, over 2/3 of students provided data. So it's a really nice, comprehensive picture of the state of Minnesota. And as you can see, we have a huge N to work with. Over 120,000 young people contributed data, which can be really beneficial when we're looking at some small groups or some rare outcomes that might not be visible or you might not have enough statistical power when you're looking at a smaller sample. I'll say a little bit about who these 120,000 kids are. They look very much like the youth of Minnesota, people you probably see every day. Even split with regards to gender, pretty even balance across the 3 grades that were included. We've got about 30% who indicated that they were experiencing some form of poverty on one of our 3 poverty measures. And we've got a number of racial and ethnic groups represented. Of course, being a Minnesota sample, it's predominantly white, about 3/4 of the kids. With regards to their vulnerabilities, we use 2 measures of sexual orientation to create 5 categories here. And you'll see that the large majority, over 90%, said that they were heterosexual, and that the rest of the sexual orientation groups are much smaller, as we would expect. 1 to 3%, even including some really small categories of 1% or less than 1% in some of these other sexual minority groups. I would just point out, though, that starting with the giant sample that we did, even in the very smallest groups, we still have almost 300 kids. So we've got a very powerful data set to look at some of these analyses. With regards to weight status, we had a good majority that were not considered overweight using the CDC's recommended cut points based on age and gender. But we had about 13% who were in that overweight category, the 85th to 95th percentile for weight, and then an additional about 9% that were considered obese according to the CDC's levels. For disabilities, again, we had a majority of kids who did not report having a physical or a mental health, behavioral, or emotional disability. But we did have about 11 or 12% who reported having a physical limitation, and another about 8 or 9% who reported that they had some mental health or behavioral or emotional condition, and then a small percent that experienced both. All right, I'll say a little bit about the measures of harassment. We were so excited to see on the latest version of the Minnesota Student Survey that they added a lot of questions, so it really allows us to look at this in new ways. The question on physical bullying read, during the last 30 days, how often have other students at school, and the pieces we used were pushed, shoved, slapped, hit, or kicked you when they weren't kidding around, or threatened to beat you up? And so we looked at kids who reported having either of those experiences, and we had a number of frequency measures that they could indicate this was happening to them. So we were able to compare kids who had this going on versus didn't with different frequencies. For relational bullying, it was the exact same block of questions. You'll see we just used other pieces of it. We were looking at last 30 days, how often have other students spread mean rumors or lies about you, or excluded you from friends, other students, or activities. And again, we had the same frequency measures to work from. The question on cyberbullying was asked separately, but very similarly. How often have you been bullied through email, chat rooms, internet, instant messaging, websites, or texting? In 2013, they added some really interesting new questions that are kind of on the cutting edge of the bullying and harassment research literature, which look at prejudice-based harassment. These are young people's perceptions on why they are getting picked on. And again, it asked, in the last 30 days, how often have students harassed or bullied you for any of the following reasons? And it included your race, ethnicity, or national origin, your religion, gender, because you're gay or lesbian, or because somebody thought you were gay or lesbian, because you have a physical or mental disability, or because of your weight or physical appearance. So these were brand new questions that were able to unpack this experience a little bit more. Okay, looking just basic numbers at the percent reporting being victimized in these three different ways, you can see that it's a fairly common occurrence, right? These dark purple bars are kids who said they've had these kinds of experiences, physical bullying, relational bullying, or cyberbullying, at least once in the past month. 13% report physical bullying, almost a quarter of kids report relational bullying, and 10% report the cyberbullying. And you can see for the more frequent measure of has this happened at least weekly or more often to you, it's an additional 5%, 11%, and 3% across those categories. So this is a really common occurrence. Over a third of kids are saying that they've been relationally bullied in the past month, some with pretty high frequency. Now, the questions that I mentioned also were asked in on the flip side. So it asked not just how often were you victimized in these ways, physically or relationally, it asked how often you perpetrated this kind of aggression against other students. And I thought that was so interesting. We were a little curious whether or not kids were going to fess up to this kind of involvement. But in fact, they did. The numbers aren't quite as high. But you can see that 10% of kids reported that they bullied somebody else in a physical manner 1 or 2 times in the past month, and an additional couple percent said they did this more often. And 14% said that they had relationally bullied somebody else in the past month, with an additional couple percent saying they did this more frequently. So there are lots of ways to cut this and lots of comparisons that you can make, but I'll just give you kind of an overview of some trends that we see with regard to demographic characteristics. Generally speaking, we see more physical bullying, victimization, as well as perpetration going on among the males compared to the females. And generally speaking, again, relational and cyberbullying are more commonly reported by the females. Still, some of all genders involved in all types of bullying, but generally that's how it shakes out with regards to gender. Overall, there's a decrease in involvement with age. This is a behavior that kind of peaks during the middle school years and with each year kind of steps downward throughout high school. We've run a number of different tests looking across race, and there were 7 different race groups that I showed you and a lot of different behaviors, and there were some differences that we noticed across race, but there weren't clear patterns that this group has a big problem with this kind of bullying. None of that really came to the fore. So I want to look now at a couple of the vulnerable group questions, looking at kids who are frequently victimized. This is experiencing these kinds of harassment weekly or more. And I've got the 3 vulnerable groups that I mentioned to begin with, and I'll just talk through the example of the purple bars with the kids who are gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And they're in the light, the kind of the lavendery bars, and then the dark purple are the kids who said they were straight. And you can see this is exactly what we expected based on existing literature, based on what we know of the world. These kids were much more likely to report frequent victimization. Same type of pattern, not quite as strong in the blue groups, with looking at kids who were overweight, and then the kids with disabilities in the light red bar also had much more frequent victimization compared to kids that did not have any sort of disability. So this was exactly what we expected. As we were looking at this, though, we were cutting variables all sorts of different ways, and we were looking at a couple of interesting things, and we started looking at bullying perpetration among these groups that are considered these vulnerable groups. And what we found for the perpetration was kind of an interesting picture. We found that not only are kids in these vulnerable groups getting more harassment, they are being victimized more frequently, they were also perpetrating bullying against other kids more frequently than kids who were not in those vulnerable groups. So again, you can see in the purple group, kids who said they were lesbian, gay, or bisexual were 3 to 4 times more likely to report perpetrating harassment compared to kids who said they were straight. And again, similar type of pattern for the overweight kids and a clearer pattern for kids with disabilities. Now, this really kind of turned our thinking on its head, and we felt this was an important thing to mention because we so often come to these kids or meet these kids with a lens of them as victims. And if we neglect to think about their potential other involvement in bullying, I think we're missing part of the story. Because kids who are involved as bullies in these interactions, they suffer many of the same health and social and emotional consequences as kids who are victimized. And kids who are playing both roles, they're the victim in one setting and a bully in another setting, they got the worst of it. And so that's a lot of these kids. So I feel like as we are dealing with patients and we're dealing with groups of young people who fit into these vulnerable categories, it's really important to consider a broader role of how they might be involved in these bullying experiences. Okay, looking now at the reasons why young people reported that they had been bullied or harassed. You can take that in. Many of these kinds of prejudice-based harassment were commonly reported, but it's hard to say the big winner here, but the clear most common reason why young people reported being bullied or harassed was around their weight or appearance. This is 1/4 of kids who reported being bullied about their weight. I'm going to talk through, there's a lot on this slide, so I want to talk through the parts of it that we looked at for a paper that one of my colleagues led up. This is looking at prejudice-based harassment among different groups, particularly among the vulnerable youth. So I'll just kind of walk through the pieces we have. We looked specifically at prejudice-based harassment around race, around sexual orientation, weight, and disability. And as we expected, the dominant group in each of those categories had the lowest rates, right? The heterosexual kids were the least likely to get teased about their sexual orientation. Kids without a disability were the least likely to get teased about having a disability. And then those in the vulnerable side of each of those categories were much more likely to get that type of harassment. That all made sense. That all fit perfectly with what we were expecting. However, when we looked at different reasons for harassment, we see these are the purple bars. Again, the darkest bars are kids who identify as heterosexual. And what I'm showing here is the rates of being victimized about a particular topic that's not necessarily related to their sexual orientation. So We've got kids who identify as a sexual minority reporting much higher rates of being teased about their race or being harassed about their weight or being harassed about having a disability, even though that has nothing to do with their particular vulnerability that we were looking at. And we have adjusted for all the different categories in here as we did this analysis. So it looks like some kids in these vulnerable groups are getting it from all sides and are getting teased and harassed about all sorts of different things. Same kind of picture here with kids with a disability. In the dark red bars are kids that don't have any particular disability, and then kids particularly who have a mental health issue or a behavioral or an emotional health issue or have both that kind of issue as well as a physical health limitation were much more likely to get harassed about sexual orientation and about their race and about their weight. So again, certain groups of kids are getting seem to be targets for all kinds of negativity, even if it's not related to anything about them personally. So to sum up at this point, what we've seen from some of our analyses in the Minnesota Student Survey is that harassment is very common, especially this relational harassment, the social bullying that's in large part can be invisible. We had about a third of kids who reported that they had this experience in the past month. So that prejudice-based harassment is also very common, and specifically kids harassing and bullying each other in some way related to their weight or their appearance was the most common form. And we saw that certain vulnerable groups experience more than their fair share of harassment, including about things that are completely unrelated to the particular characteristic that might make them vulnerable in the first place. Okay. Back to my overview, I'll spend just a little bit of time, and I mean just like one slide, talking about the so what question. Why is this a problem? And I feel like this is so different from when I gave similar kinds of talks 10 years ago, when there was a very different attitude towards bullying. There was more of an idea that we need to toughen kids up. It's not really that big a deal. Kids will be kids, and kids are just mean, and everybody has to deal with this. I don't hear any of that anymore. I think there's a general acknowledgement, as has been shown in the research, and as I'm sure many of you have seen in your clinical practice, that bullying is harmful to all players who are involved in that kind of situation. There's a strong literature, a large literature, showing that bullying involvement predicts a number of different poor health, social, educational, and emotional outcomes. Somatic complaints, mental health issues, distress, suicide, eating disorders, social adjustment, violent behaviors acting out, substance use coming up, school issues, criminal activity later in life. This is a robust body of studies. They've been cross-sectional with small and large samples. They've been all over the world. They've been longitudinal. They've taken measurements from the kids themselves and the parents and the teachers and anyone else who will provide data. And it's a very consistent body of work. This is a very damaging experience for young people. I'll just give one little example, again, from the Minnesota Student Survey of how the numbers look. We looked at the percent of kids who reported attempting suicide in the past year. So these are kids in very, very high distress. We see that among kids who are not involved in any bullying in the past month, only 2% of them reported this high level of distress, reported a suicide attempt. We look at these numbers among kids who had been victimized. It's 11%. Those who said they were involved as bullies, 6%. And again, the kids who were involved as both bullies and victims in different situations, much, much higher rates of involvement in suicide, in a suicide attempt in the past year. Now I want to say a little bit about what is associated with bullying behaviors, because these are the clues on where we can intervene to prevent ongoing bullying and change the experience for young people with their involvement here. I'm going to introduce the social, or perhaps refresh for many of you, the social ecological model of public health, or social ecological framework, which talks about various levels of influence on kids' health or their health behaviors or their health experience. And so it always starts with the kid in the middle who is bullying or being bullied or in some way experiencing a negative health issue. We know that there are a number of characteristics about that kid, himself or herself, that might contribute to bullying behavior. These are this kid's intrapersonal characteristics. As I mentioned, there are a number of vulnerabilities that this kid might have. Additional things like that kid's own social skills, how he or she relates to other people, their own personality, their internal assets. There are all sorts of characteristics that kid sitting in front of you brings to a bullying experience that could be worked on to prevent future bullying. This kid, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. He or she has a lot of relationships with other people, and there are a lot of characteristics and qualities of those interpersonal relationships that might contribute to bullying behavior as well. And so these can be things with the peer group, it can be things with the family, it can be with the teacher or the healthcare provider or the coach or the adults in the neighborhood. Basically, any interpersonal interaction has qualities about it that might contribute to a young person acting out in an aggressive way versus not. It can be supportive and loving and really build the kid up and build up their self-esteem, make them feel like they don't need to act out in this way. Or we know that a lot of negative interactions, a lot of negativity at home or violence in the home or witnessing those kinds of experiences might play a role in developing bullying behaviors. All of these relationships, many of these relationships, happen in the framework of certain organizations or certain institutions. For example, a lot of peer interactions take place at school, and so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this portion is about characteristics of the school that might contribute to bullying behavior or might contribute to healthier peer interactions. Same thing goes for youth sports or churches or any other organization or institution that has its own policies, it has its own programs, it has its own way that we do things here, it has its own staff, it has its own all sorts of characteristics that can either contribute to a safer environment for kids or to a less safe environment for kids. And these organizations and everything else in them also exist within a community or in the larger social setting. And as we know, that communities and large social groups also have differences, and they can play out in terms of different policies governing behaviors. They can play out in terms of media content, media messages, or larger social norms that just give a sense of this behavior is acceptable here or this behavior is not acceptable here. That can be really very powerful in terms of a kid growing up learning what they should be like in different settings, in different situations. So a lot of my work, as Iris mentioned, focuses on these organizational and the community and social levels. So I'm going to stay for the rest of my time, focus on some work that we've been doing, looking specifically at schools, and if I have time, the other media messages coming through the social level. Okay. So one of the main prevention approaches that's come up as people realized bullying was an important problem, has been school-based interventions. Changing school policies, changing school programs, developing curricula to teach kids about compassion or to train teachers to identify bullying, to train kids to be active bystanders. There's a lot of things that can be applied differently in different schools, whether they use a zero-tolerance policy or and bounce somebody into suspension versus trying a conflict resolution type program where it's aiming to bring kids together. A lot of different things have been tried, and they become then characteristics of the school intended to be safer and better and healthier in terms of bullying activity. Unfortunately, a couple recent large-scale reviews have looked at a number of these randomized control trials with these schools, so solid studies, and had really mixed findings. Largely finding that a lot of these programs don't have any effect. They test the kids at the beginning and they test the kids 2 years later, and there's not much change in bullying. Or in some cases, it's even gone up. There have been some inverse associations found. We can talk about measurement and things like that that might contribute to that finding. Generally speaking, from the reviews that have been done, the more comprehensive interventions tend to fare better. They tend to be more effective. If you've got the teachers on board and the policy in place and you've got programs and you've got families involved, you've got the local police involved, you've got billboards in your community, the more that you can put this together to be a comprehensive kind of intervention, the better the program will do in terms of reducing bullying overall. So there's really been this blanket approach. Schools and communities should do everything they can to address all kinds of bullying because there's been a rallying cry. There's been a lot in the news. There have been a lot of really high-profile, tragic cases that have been linked back to bullying. And so people are aware of this and want to do something that's going to help. So the approach is everyone do everything all at the same time. And as we've seen, it hasn't panned out as well as one might hope. So what my research team and I have been working on is looking at some different characteristics of schools to see if there's something else about the quality of the school or the characteristic of the school that could be tapped to move towards bullying prevention in the schools. And specifically, we're looking at a number of risk and protective factors. I'll start with the risk factors. We're looking at the proportion of students in a school setting who report that they feel unsafe. They feel unsafe in the bathrooms. They feel unsafe walking down the halls. We've got those kinds of measures. We're looking at the proportion of students who say there's a lot of violence in my school. Kids are in gangs in my school. There's a lot of delinquent activity. There's a lot of trouble in my school. And we're looking at the percent of kids who report experiencing school discipline. They've been called to the principal's office, or they've had in-school suspension, or they've been expelled from school. If you put all these together, that is a really powerful environment to be in for 7 or 8 hours a day. And those are the kids that you're moving around with. That environment, my hunch, is probably not where any of us want our own kids to be spending time, but really does characterize some schools in Minnesota. We are also looking at a number of protective factors. So in this side of the equation, we're looking at the proportion of students that report having very high internal assets. They've got good self-regulation, they've got good social skills, they're sort of emotionally balanced. There are a lot of that kind of kid in the school. We're also looking at kids with a high academic orientation, and this is kids who are getting good grades and they feel they are college-bound, they enjoy school, they are interested in what they're learning, those kinds of measures. So going to school with a lot of kids like that can characterize the setting. And we're looking at kids who report that they have good teachers at their school. The teachers care about them. The teachers respect kids. The teachers are there for them. Those kinds of measures. So going to that kind of school is going to be a very different experience than going to a school characterized by more of the negativity. And every school that we looked at in Minnesota has some kind of balance of these different characteristics. Oh, sorry, we also looked at school demographics, things like how big is the school, is it located in an urban or suburban or a rural setting, and then what are some characteristics of the student body, things like the racial and ethnic profile. Again, we turned to the Minnesota Student Survey, which we were thrilled to see had lots and lots of questions related to these risk and protective factors. And we were able to compile these in such a way that we can then describe the school setting. So each kid filled out his or her survey, and we put together scales or indices of related questions to get at an overall idea of academic orientation, or an overall idea of internal assets or unsafe feeling of being unsafe. And on each of these, there's a distribution, of course, among all these students. And we were able to aggregate their responses and look at the characteristics of the school. So every student answered 120,000, but they were all nested in about 500 schools. And so then each school gets a score for that particular characteristic. And then our analysis was able to look at the characteristic of the school in relation to the bullying experience of all these kids who go to school there. All right. This is where it gets a little complicated in terms of how we created these, but I'll give the example of the internal assets. Kids filled out surveys, they got a score, and of course there's a range and probably a nice bell-shaped curve of young people's internal assets. We then looked at kids who were in the top 25%. This is the cream of the crop internal asset kids. They're high on this whole scale. For the school score, we looked at the percent of students in that school that come from this high cream of the crop internal assets group. And so you can see the average on all of our protective factors was about 24%, 25%, because we cut it at the quartile. But what I think is more interesting is looking at the range here. What this is showing us is that across our 505 schools, there are some schools where not a single kid came from that high-end, great internal assets. And then on the other end, there's some schools where half the kids, 52% of the kids, came from that group of really high internal asset kids. So those are really, very different experiences of being in that school. It was the same kind of thing with the academic index. There were schools where not a single kid was at the high end of the academic orientation, and then schools where half the kids came from that group. Teachers also had a similar, even a larger spread, where a lot of teachers were reported to be very positive, or schools were very few. And then for the unsafe schools and the discipline problems, we cut it a little differently. We cut it at 10%. That's why those were so much lower, closer to 10%. But again, you can really see the range here. You can see that in some schools, no kids said they felt unsafe walking through the school. And in some schools, like over a quarter of the kids said they felt unsafe. So really different vibe. We looked then at how this experience of being in these different kinds of schools was related to their bullying, victimization in particular. And what we found here is that for internal assets in particular, we found that going to a school where everybody's from that high-end group, everybody is highly functioning, they've got good internal assets, going to that kind of school was associated with significantly lower odds of physical bullying, relational bullying, and cyberbullying. And then on the flip side, we found, as we expected, that going to schools that were really characterized by being unsafe places or having a lot of discipline problems going on, those were associated with having much higher odds of physical, relational, and cyberbullying going on. So this is kind of different from imposing a policy about bullying or teaching kids in a classroom setting about bullying. This is really the character of the school. We found a similar kind of picture. It's not quite as clean, looking at the prejudice-based harassment. But again, we saw that the internal assets were associated with less prejudice-based harassment around orientation and weight. And we found that the unsafe schools were associated with greater levels, higher levels of prejudice-based harassment around several of the measures. So a couple quirky things came out, but by and large, that was the picture that we were getting. So that brings us to the piece about future research and future action. Thinking about working with schools or working in schools to change the setting, we would try and guide schools towards increasing internal assets across the student body as a possible avenue to reduce bullying. So it's a little bit different from a traditional bullying prevention kind of model, because it's just about working with the kids on developing their self-regulation habits and their social interactions and their feelings of sort of emotional management, those kinds of characteristics. The next piece then is developing and testing school-tailored intervention programs so that they fit with what the issues are at that particular school. If schools have a lot of a particular kind of kid or have safety issues or have academic things that characterize their school, design programs that are intended to work in that kind of school that might not be the best fit for a different kind of school, but might be more focused on the issues at hand in that setting. And those are the kinds of programs that I think will be the next wave, and the next wave of studies will evaluate those kinds of programs. Okay, I have a few minutes left. So I want to go to a completely different kind of study that I'm excited about, I've been having a lot of fun with, looking at some community and social factors that we think are likely to be associated with bullying experiences. And I'm looking particularly here at media messages and social norms. So I'll say a little bit about this different study, because this is not from the Minnesota Student Survey. This is from another study where we're looking at instances of weight-related teasing and other kinds of stigma and harassment that are shown in popular TV shows. And we started with surveys of almost 3,000 students, and we asked them to list their favorite TV shows as part of this survey, where they filled out all sorts of measures on all sorts of things. We asked them to write in their top 3 favorite TV shows, and they did, and we generated a list of 653 different TV shows, and then focused in on the top 10, really the most popular shows. Any guesses as to what's on the top 10 list? It's a couple years ago, so it's a little bit outdated, but these are still on the air, very popular. Simpsons, excellent. Any other ideas? No other guesses? What is it? I haven't even heard of that one. Okay. Here are the shows that we had. Family Guy, #1 most popular show. Simpsons came in at #2. SpongeBob, we had a lot of cartoons. CSI, iCarly, South Park, 2.5 Men, That 70s Show, The Game, and George Lopez rounded out our top 10 list of shows that kids told us these are their favorite shows, this is what they watch. I worked with a colleague in the School of Public Health and a couple graduate students, and we created a very long and comprehensive coding document and had our research assistants watch 3 episodes of each of these shows. And they watched them multiple times, and they went through this code book and noted every type of stigmatizing activity, every type of weight-related comment, every type of teasing that came up in any of these shows. And what we found was that there was a lot of it. 50% of the episodes viewed included at least one instance of teasing specifically about weight, or harassment, or one weight stigmatizing image or something like that, specifically around weight. And it wasn't just overweight characters that were getting harshed on. It was about half overweight characters, but it was 40% characters who were not overweight. So it was really across the board that there was a lot of teasing and a lot of stigmatizing about weight. The remaining people couldn't be characterized because it was comments about people who were not on screen or were not characters on the show. A couple other interesting things I would just bring out about this. We looked at, as I said, we looked at a number of different kinds of teasing and stigmatizing incidents, and then looked at the proportion of those that were weight-related. And we found that on shows that were intended for youth, they've got a youth audience or a youth rating, about over half of the teasing and stigmatizing incidences on this were specific to weight. So that was a really different picture from the shows that were marketed for adults or were created for an adult audience, had fewer than 10% of the stigmatizing and the teasing instances that were about weight. So really kind of a different picture. A lot of teasing that they're seeing, and a lot of that is about body shape and size. One other thing that I would comment on, a finding from this paper about responses to weight stigmatizing comments, is that the target, the on-screen target, whoever's getting teased, in most cases did not respond. And it didn't respond negatively. So negative responses were things like if they cried, or they looked sad, or they made some sort of comment, or said something to indicate that that didn't sit well with them. That only happened a third of the time that people got teased. The rest of the time there was no comment, there was no response from the person who got teased. But I think just as interestingly, audience laughter followed about 40% of those instances. That was the punchline, that was the joke. So taking these together, I'm thinking of kids sitting on their iPads, or sitting in their room, or sitting somewhere, watching these shows every day after school, or a couple times a week, and getting lots and lots of messages, lots of images about weight teasing in this world, about who's getting teased, about what is an appropriate response if you get teased yourself, and kind of getting the message that this is likely to be the butt of the joke, and that it's not appropriate to speak out in most situations. I feel like that really creates a very powerful social norm, which I imagine is likely to seep into a person's consciousness and lead to different body image issues, disordered eating issues, some emotional distress, emotional well-being issues. I've gotten ahead of myself because that's my future research in action, is that we're actually going to be able to link these data from the popular shows to the kids who said they watched those shows, and we have some measures of how much they watch TV. So we'll be able to see how that exposure is related to their own emotional distress, their own eating behaviors, their own acting out behaviors towards other people. So I can see in terms of future action steps around this, if the literature comes to support this, that the same way we recommend parents co-view with their kids, or that parents screen out media content that's very violent, or has a lot of sexual content, or has a lot of substance use content, that the same kind of messages go out around stigmatizing behaviors that are shown on screen and stigmatizing messages. Okay. Before I end, let me just check where I am. Before I end, I want to think a little bit about what is next and what you can do as healthcare providers who work one-on-one with young people. I know many of you are great about tuning into this and asking about victimizing experiences when you talk with young people. Those are often some standard questions. I would urge you, though, as you're having those conversations, to ask questions in a way that can capture a broader scope of bullying involvement. As we saw that even some kids who are considered very vulnerable to harassment may also be acting out, and they might have different needs for support, they might have different needs for intervention, acting out as they would, compared to what they would need functioning solely as a victim. So if we come at them with a narrow lens, we might be missing things. So I urge you to ask your questions in a way that can draw out some of those other experiences. I would say also feel free to ask kids about school-wide factors. What's it like at your school? How is it at your school? Are kids nice? Is there a lot of, is there trouble at your school? To work with them on how to manage that scenario, because they're going there every day, and the kid in front of you is in the center of the circle with whatever he or she brings to the table, and they need to function in that environment. So working with them to figure out what they need to get through the day in that way. And if media exposure is an issue, again, I know people talk to families about media exposure, I would say add this to the list. What kind of harsh, mean, bullying, stigmatizing behaviors are you seeing on screen every day, and what do you make of that? The thing I would end with is to ask you to please don't be afraid to get involved. Generally speaking, the health world operates pretty separately from the education world. And the kids kind of run back and forth between the two, and the families run back and forth between the two. But it's pretty rare to have a healthcare provider's voice at the school, and that can be an extremely powerful voice. So if you're working with a kid that you're concerned about, I would say don't be afraid to make that phone call to the principal, make that phone call to the teacher, write a letter to the community newspaper, whatever it is, to branch out of the medical sphere that you are quite expert in and move a little bit into the sphere where kids are spending a lot of hours of their day, because your voice is very important in that setting, and I think not heard it as often as we'd love to have it be. Before ending, I just want to thank my colleagues on the Healthy Environments and Vulnerable Youth team who have done lots and lots of analysis and really contributed to the thinking around this, as well as acknowledge our funders from the Maternal and Child Health Bureau that supported this analysis of the Minnesota Student Survey. Thank you. Happy to take questions if people have them. Yes? Yes. This is our inside name. This is the question was about if we have youth on our team, and it is actually it is a research team, so it's colleagues here at the university who have a research focus on adolescent health, and particularly on bullying and aggressive behaviors, as well as possibly a focus on one or more of these vulnerable groups of youth that they've worked with in their own experience. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Can you describe what discordant heterosexual, how that's defined on the survey? I haven't heard that phrase before.
Yes, it's a relatively new way that folks in the research world looking at LGBT health are starting to categorize some kids, and the recommendation is always to use more than one measure, if it's available on a survey, to characterize sexual orientation, because it's a very complex construct, obviously, and more measurement to kind of pin this down is considered to be better. We were thrilled that the Minnesota Student Survey had 2 questions on, as opposed to the one that they previously had, and one was an identity measure, asking kids just to tick the box for how they identified, as heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or unsure. And then we had a separate question, pages and pages later, about their sexual behaviors. And it asked if they had been sexually active with males, and then the separate question asked how many female partners they had. It was the number of partners. So we were able to cross that with gender, obviously, and figure out who had had same-sex partners. And so for the most part, we took young people at their word in terms of their identity, because many of them were not sexually active, and that identity, how they felt about themselves, seemed to be closer to what we were getting at. But we found that some kids who identified as heterosexual also reported that they had had same-sex partners in the past year. And that, given some of the previous literature, and knowing that they were at higher risk generally than kids who identified as heterosexual, their behaviors were heterosexual, we wanted to recognize that this might be a separate risk group. So we created this discordant heterosexual category. Yeah. So.
On the school survey, when kids are asked to identify whether they've been bullied, was it written what bullying is? Did you define bullying? Does the questionnaire define bullying for them?
No, it did not. That's a great question. Bullying, and so I started off here with a definition of exactly what counted, and the survey did not include those details. It was really left up to the kids and what they know from their own exposure to bullying prevention programs or their own lived experience to describe that for themselves.
And just a second quick question. They're going to do this again theoretically in 2016.
Theoretically.
And do you get any input into what they're going to ask, or how are they going to determine what's asked?
From your mouth to their ears. They did a big revision in 2013, and many of us were at the table. We've got a great relationship with folks on the Minnesota Student Survey interagency team that operates this survey. And they came to us with specific questions. We're considering lots of these different measures and which are the best and the strongest. They also invited us to bring some new measures to the table. That's how we got a second sexual orientation item on the survey. And we've gotten a number of additional items. But because they did a big revise in 2013, they're probably not going to do a big revise in 2016 would be my guess. Yeah, Nimi.
Nimi, I have the mic.
Oh, sorry. Claudia.
Thanks, Marla, for this really nice presentation. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about the kid who is the victim and the bully at the same time. I think that setting creates some challenges perhaps for teachers who see maybe preferentially or with blinders on only the lashing out, and not see the victimization that happens. Do you know if these kids who are both perpetrators and victims, did they all start off as victims? And it seems like in my practice, I see a lot of kids who have been bullied, and a lot of kids who are, they're fed up with it, and so they are lashing out, and then they're the ones getting in trouble and suspended and expelled.
Yes, it's a great question, and this survey definitely was not able to tease apart which came first. And I think a lot of research that does look at the combination of the bullying and the victim also isn't able to get at this chicken and egg question. But we also know that bullying, being bullied might not be in the same setting as they are acting out, right? So a kid might be getting it at home from a parent or a sibling, might be getting it from a kid down the street that's not necessarily in their class, but they're so pent up that when somebody comes to them, they lash out, and they get busted in that setting, even though the rest of it very obviously contributed, but that might not be seen by the teacher or other school staff.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, I see the same thing in my clinic all the time, that they start out as victims of bullying, and then when they lash out, they're the ones who get in trouble and are branded the bullies.
It's very much a learned behavior. I mean, violent behavior is a learned behavior, so it makes a lot of sense that a kid's receiving it before they're lashing out. I think it probably is unusual to have somebody who their first experience with bullying involvement is acting out towards another kid, and then it turns on them.
So I attended a session at the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine this past week on bullying and cyberbullying in particular, and I was disheartened to find that my personal experience in clinic was very much reflected nationally, and that is this phenomenon where if you have a child who comes to clinic and reports being bullied, and they give you the story, and then you try to intervene as a clinician, so I will call the principal, I'll write a letter saying I'm really concerned that this person's capacity to learn is being compromised because of the unsafe environment. Could you please look at this? In conversations with principals in particular, they are very reluctant to punish the bullies because the bullies' parents will typically then sue the school. So guess where the bullies are learning their bullying behavior from? But there's this sort of First Amendment right to speech. That is the most common reason why schools end up not acting on individual cases. Right. And what ends up happening more often than not is that child ends up having to leave that school system or end up homeschooled. And that was a common sort of scenario across the country. So very frustrating in terms of what can be done after the fact. Yes. So all the more reason why I'm really excited to see you really talking about what I would consider primary prevention and really changing the school culture. Because going after it after the fact is hugely unsatisfying and usually victimizes the patient and the family all over again.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's several great points in what you said, that it's the prevention, I think, is where it's at, and obviously we want to prevent all sorts of negative health experiences for young people. But I hear the frustration, and I absolutely agree with it. And you may have noticed there's an absence in my presentation of a long list of things that you can do and how to fix this and how to solve this problem, because there are not clear answers. It's complicated by parents. It's complicated by laws about getting educational information and sharing information outside of the health system. It's complicated by family dynamics. It's complicated by a lot of things, and there are not easy answers. I would direct you to one particular resource that might be useful. It's produced by the Maternal and Child Health Bureau at HRSA, and that is a website called stopbullying.gov. Easy one to remember. And that does have some resources and some suggestions for people from different angles trying to approach this problem. Yeah. Yes?
I work on a crisis stabilization adolescent mental health unit here in the hospital, and I'm just curious, a lot of our kids our admits into the unit are very high during the school year, but very low during the summer or holiday areas. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, as a unit, we're struggling to figure out how kids would know that we're a resource and that we're something that's available, but not during a school season. So what would you see as a resource or a way to assist or facilitate safe spaces for these youth outside of the school year?
I think that's great that you've got a system in place that's tapping into kids during the school year. Just thinking about where kids spend time in the summers, a lot of them are not engaged in formal structures. They're not going to summer schools or camps or organized activities, so they'll be harder to reach. But many of them are doing something, whether it's doing some sort of camp program or an after school or a summer kind of activity program, working through community education or working through the neighborhood sports leagues, things like that, just to get your information available. At least in Minneapolis, I can speak to because that's where I live, but the parks offer free meals during the day for kids who are in need. So there is a lot of traffic in and out of the community centers. So putting flyers up there, they've got shelves distributing information, tapping into some of those resources might be a way to connect. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.